and I'm moderating this October session. Thank you, Jolene, for starting today's recording. These sessions are intended to showcase cutting-edge research performed by faculty members of MMRI towards promoting collaboration and networking. And to that end, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Café van Heusden. Café is an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at the School of Engineering at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus. She received an MSc from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands and a PhD from EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. And prior to joining the School of Engineering, she was a research associate at UBC Vancouver, where she developed an automated drug delivery service for anesthesia. Her current research focus is on high performance and high precision in robotics and mechatronics through data-driven and learning control, as well as emerging applications of sensing and control technology in agriculture to improve sustainability. Thank you very much for your talk, Café, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation and the opportunity to talk about my work. And thank you all for attending. Can I share my screen?
Yes, Jolene, you'll need to issue that. Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
All right, here we go. And so I can't tell actually what you can see on your screen now. And can I do this in full mode, or is this fine?
I can only see a sidebar in your Adobe Reader.
You can only see the sidebar.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Is this better?
Yes. That looks good to me.
Interesting. Okay, I'll be staring at a different screen. As you mentioned, I only recently started in the School of Engineering, and I have not gone through 2 years of online teaching, so I am still learning about Zoom. All right. Well, again, thank you very much for having me here. I have to admit I was a little bit on the fence about what I was going to present today, because the work that I'm currently focusing on and the work that I will be doing in my lab here is very much related to manufacturing and even materials a little bit. But as a research associate and as a postdoctoral fellow before that, I spent a little bit over 10 years working on medical devices, and I feel like that work might be slightly less of interest to the audience here interested in manufacturing. So I decided to talk about the underlying technology a little bit and talk about how the heck did I get from industrial robotics and mechatronics to the artificial pancreas, anesthesia, and then back to automated welding. So on the left here, we see an industrial robot and a lab setup. Actually, the second one here is a lab setup that is often used. It's a flexible mechanical system which exhibits some control challenges that are very common in mechatronic systems with resonances. And then in the middle here we have an artificial pancreas. This one I think is actually from Medtronic, is actually on the market at the moment. In the top corner, a picture reflecting automated anesthesia, and then in the bottom a welding robot. And so my research is on feedback control, on control systems technology, and this is enabling technology. It's often been referred to as hidden technology, in the sense that it's present in a lot of different industrial systems, in the process industry, and also in consumer products. But it's often essential to the functioning of the system, or at least to the performance that the system can achieve, but it's hidden to the end user. therefore often called hidden technology. And the specific feedback and control technology that my expertise is in using data to either enable or improve the performance of such feedback systems. So what I'll talk about today is I'll give a bit of a broad introduction to control system design and feedback for those of you who are less familiar with this field, and then an introduction into identification for control and data-driven control. And then, despite the title, I actually won't talk about anesthesia, but I decided to talk about the artificial pancreas instead, because I think the work that I did on the artificial pancreas is a really good example of what I'm trying to talk about here today. And I also realized that I don't think I've actually ever presented this work other than in the published publication. And then I'll talk about some more recent work on automated welding. So when I talk about feedback or closed loop control, this is what I'm talking about. We have a system. Can you see my mouse? A system, in this case, in closed loop anesthesia, it's actually the patient who is receiving drugs that bring in a state of hypnosis that allows for a procedure to happen. And what we want to do is actually control that depth of hypnosis as well as possible. So this is our system, in this case, the human. So we'll have to be able to measure what the effect is of our intervention, in this case, the drug delivery. So we need a sensor that, in this case, measures the depth of hypnosis. And the signal or the feedback from that sensor then goes into our control algorithm, and the controller somewhat decides what the change or the next infusion should be. And to actually make that change in our real system, we need an actuator. So in the case of closed loop anesthesia, we have a pump that actually delivers that amount of drug to the patient. And as I said, it's enabling technology. The technology is roughly the same for a wide variety of systems, but obviously if you have an industrial robot like this or an artificial pancreas, you cannot get away with the same controllers. So we're going to need some information on the system to be able to design that feedback system. And this is often a model. And then you can try as hard as you want, but you're never going to capture the complete dynamics up to 100%. And this is particularly true in these medical applications where there's so much uncertainty. But this is also true in high precision systems. And this is where identification for control comes in, when it deals with, so the field is a subfield of system identification, which deals with questions as to how do you find a model that is useful for controller design, or how do we know if a model that we have is actually going to be useful for controller design. And so the standard approach to controller design would be model-based, where either using first principles or using data, we define a model of our system, and then you often have some kind of control criteria that you try to optimize or minimize. And then so this could be an optimization step that then leads to the controller. And just to clarify, because data-driven and data-driven techniques and learning are used very widely these days. So to narrow that down a little bit, what I'm talking about here is often a black box structure, but with a very limited parameterization for the model. We can often get away with discrete time dynamical models that are described by difference equations. So the model structure here is relatively limited with a limited number of parameters and often linear. So the problem if you do this, specifically if you go from data to a model, this would be a learning step or an identification step using optimization. You come up with an approximate model, and there's going to be some modeling errors. And now if I use that approximate model where I've lost some of the information that was in my data to minimize my control performance, to minimize my control criterion, then the performance that I'm going to achieve on the actual system isn't going to match my designed performance. So any modeling errors here in the model are going to affect the performance of my ultimate controller. And then another problem with this approach is that so you can make this approximate model more and more accurate by making it more and more complex if you have the data for that. But often, due to the methodology to design a controller, the complexity of this controller depends on the complexity of this model. So we actually often want a simple approximate model because it'll give us a simple control. If I then talk about data-driven control, that actually gets rid of both of these problems because now instead of having data-driven modeling, I'm going to do data-driven control where I use my data directly to optimize over this control criterion and to directly find this controller. So I'm avoiding this modeling step altogether, thereby avoiding any modeling errors. And because I haven't imposed any intermediate structure on that model, I'm also not generally restricted in the complexity of my controller. You do run into a couple of issues though, such as stability, because in the standard approach, we have a model here in the middle, and even if it's approximate, we have an idea of how good it is, and we can use standard stability analysis and robustness margins to evaluate whether that controller is going to work in real life. In our data-driven approach, we don't have that model anymore. So how do you guarantee stability? And then the second issue is that the noise will affect this optimization problem a little bit differently than the original data-driven modeling approach. So those are two things that I worked on in my PhD, where I proposed a data-driven controller design technique that can guarantee closed-loop stability. So if we go back to this model-based approach, so why are these modeling errors such a big issue, specifically in feedback control? And the reason is that it's actually really not straightforward to evaluate what the impact of a modeling mismatch or what the impact of uncertainty is on closed loop behavior. So this is taken from an example of a biomedical example where you have a response of a patient. So let's say I give a patient a certain amount of drug, and then I look at 3 different patients. The response is going to be completely different. Actually, one is even unstable, whereas this bottom one is stable. So these are really quite different. And if I would have a model that I try to fit to these 3 curves, I'm going to end up with a huge variability. But now if I use one and the same fixed linear controller on all 3 of these systems, you can hardly distinguish the closed loop response. So apparently whatever this uncertainty is here doesn't actually matter for my controller design, because it's not going to affect the performance of my closed loop system, which is what I'm ultimately aiming for. On the other hand, I can have here 3 responses in open loop that look awfully similar, but if I put them in closed loop, they don't at all. So in this case, you better make sure that whatever you're doing in your modeling, it captures whatever this difference is, because that apparently is important for feedback. And so this is where identification for control comes in. So in this modeling step here, it actually also takes this control criterion into account and optimizes this approximate model for that specific objective of feedback control. And so here the goal would be to find an approximate model here such that the performance that you achieve on the real system matches what you had designed. And again, this is not really necessary in the data-driven approach because we don't have an approximation there in the middle. And this model accuracy is critical, first of all, in these high precision and mechatronic applications where you're pushing the limits of performance. But it's also very critical when the uncertainty and variability is high in the biomedical application. So that really is how all these different applications tie together. And then the third one, for systems where accurate modeling is too expensive or too difficult, this is often a motivation that is used for developing data-driven control techniques, and this field is gaining a lot of traction again in the last few years. It's a little bit debatable depending on the structure that you use, whether that argument really holds in my mind. So how does this apply to high variable systems? I worked at the University of California in Santa Barbara for a little while on the artificial pancreas, which is an automated system for individuals with type 1 diabetes. So in individuals with type 1 diabetes, their pancreas no longer makes insulin, and insulin is what moves the blood sugar to the cells. So if you cannot make insulin, you cannot control the blood sugar anymore. And so in this graph on the top here, you see a blood glucose reading 12 hours of a healthy individual where the blood glucose is controlled really tightly versus somebody with diabetes, where we're kind of all over the place. And particularly these highs here above 200, 250, I guess, are detrimental. Those are detrimental to the long-term health, and long-term high glucose causes some of the well-known long-term effects of diabetes. Whereas these lows here, if you go below 50 particularly, is more of a short-term worry, because that can lead to coma and even death. And so automating insulin delivery for these patients has proven quite difficult, partly because of challenges in hardware and challenges in measuring glucose in the blood, which is often indirectly measured, not in the blood. But another big obstacle is that to design those algorithms, you would need a model. And the system is really hard to model. So first principle models are not accurate for individuals. They're also too complex for controller design. And at the same time, clinical data is not informative. So you can't actually do very much in terms of model learning. And the reason is visible here in this graph. So here in the top graph, we've got the blood glucose. And here we have the meal intakes. And here we have the insulin doses. So the meals are given at the exact same time as the insulin, which pretty much makes it impossible to distinguish the effect of glucose intake from the effect of insulin intake. And it would be ethically unacceptable to separate those too much, because it would cause insufficient glucose control. So what I did in my work is I proposed simple approximate models that capture information that is relevant for feedback. So we did start with these more complex physiological, say, first principle models. We approximated them for a set of 10 patients here. Those are the gray lines. And so this is from a simulator that has actually been approved by the FDA as an alternative to animal testing prior to clinical trials. So prior to clinical trials in humans. So it's well validated. It's widely used in the field. So what we did is, we came up with this blue model instead. So this is the Bode diagram here, the magnitude and the phase and the frequency. And you see that at low frequencies, this model is terrible. Like, it does not capture what this patient's response would be like at all. But we know that for feedback, that doesn't actually matter, because what matters for feedback is the response around the bandwidth. And so what we tried to do here is optimize this model around the bandwidth so that it kind of captures the worst case scenario. So we have an over approximation of the gain and an over approximation of the phase shift, which means that if I'm going to use this model in a controller design, I know that if I use it on the real patient, my robustness margins are going to be met, meaning that patient safety is not a worry. And that's indeed exactly what it did. If you use these models instead of what was the prior state of the art, you can increase safety without compromising performance. And so this is a CVGA plot, which is used fairly standard in the field of control of diabetes, and I think in diabetes in general. So again, we're worried about these high blood glucose values. So these are on the y-axis. This is the maximum throughout the simulation period. And then we're worried about these lower ones. So this is the lowest value achieved during the simulation period. And what we want to avoid is really high blood glucose and really low ones here. So preferably we all want to be in this green zone. And so we had this controller, which was based on a limited simulation model of 10 individuals. And then we used it to simulate the response on a full 100 individuals. So this is the full 100 patient simulator that has been approved by the FDA. So if you show good performance on that simulator, you can be cleared to do clinical trials. And so the prior state of the art are these white dots, where we don't have too many really high ones, but we do have a couple of patients that are at risk of low glucose here. And we shifted all of those to where the black ones are. So we got entirely rid of these lows. So we significantly increased patient safety. But at the same time, so we didn't increase any of the highs, but if you look at the values here, we actually pushed a lot of these white dots that were on the x-axis, so that never actually got below 110, we pushed them towards lower values. So we actually got better control using these more appropriate models. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit to much more recent work, maybe more closely related to the interest of some of the listeners here. It's in automated welding, and automated welding is not new. It's widely used think of automotive, 30, 40, 50 years maybe since the first welding robots. Characteristics of the systems and the applications where it's been really successful is low mix, high volume, meaning that every single product is very much the same. All the parts are very close to specs, and we're making a lot of them, which means that pre-programmed robotics is worthwhile there, because you can spend a lot of time and effort programming the robots to weld from A to B for every single piece, and that would actually work. There's been really interesting developments in robotics, particularly in collaborative robots, that now really make application of automation, that make it possible to automate processes that were previously not worthwhile automating, because you can use these collaborative robots with a human really close to the robot, where the human can help, for example, in welding, do all the positioning, which would be really hard to automate. And then once the positioning is done properly, the robot can take over and automatically weld. So these are some really, so the bottom figure is actually from a Fanuc robot. Sorry, is it Fanuc? I don't know. One that's on the market at the moment. That's very recent. That's just come out in the last few years. And so what you can do with this type of a system is go to automated welding for high mix, low volume applications. And the one that I've been looking at for, I guess, the last 2 years is pipe welding. And one of the characteristics here is that two pieces of pipe are put together manually. Tacks are put on, but they're attached manually, which means that there's actually quite a wide variability in the width of the seam that you're trying to weld, and also in the exact dimensions of that seam. And then in addition, the pipes will be attached to a positioner in a way that might be slightly off-centric. So you get additional variability in there. And to increase the level of automation in some of these applications, one of the bottlenecks is sensing. And so there's a lot of research going on and a lot of interesting advances and successes using more vision systems for vision-based feedback control. And so one of the first things you need if you want to make a high quality weld is to control the position of the torch with respect to the seam, which means that you need to sense the seam location. And so in this project, we were looking at fillet welds. So fillet welds are when you're welding together a piece, two pieces like this, and the weld would be in here. Now picture that that's a pipe that's rotating, and you have a camera somewhere pointing at that. There's just absolutely no way you can get a perpendicular angle on that. So you'll have some kind of funny angle that makes it quite challenging to figure out what the seam position is, because in addition, all you can see in images or even in thermal images is the melt pool, is because the contrast is so high in normal visible light, and the temperatures are so high in infrared. The information you get is not great. So it's actually quite a challenging vision problem. And in addition to that, because of this positioning, because we're not perpendicular, if the melt pool moves at all, it might not even be possible to find that seam position from these types of images. So a student I've been working with, Mobina Mobaraki in Vancouver, has been looking at seam tracking for these fillet welds. And this work was actually more focused towards whether you can actually find that seam location from this type of images. And then in the first attempt on using a machine vision, she got 61% of the images had a horizontal error of less than 0.2 millimeters. And if you look at this graph here, this is typically what you would see in any, actually it's not typically, but this is what we see in the errors. So there seems to be some kind of oscillation in there, which may be due to the weave. So you can improve that 61% or the 88% vertically by doing some filtering, right? You can put some filtering on here and you'll get a much better estimate. But does it actually lead to better control? And this is what I find really intriguing in these vision-based control systems, is that if we go back to this original image that I had, we've now actually added a step in here. So like, obviously this data would have always come from a sensor, but often the sensor would be optimized in terms of electronics. Whereas now we go from an image to this data, and there's an actual optimization step in terms of machine learning that's added here to either my model-based approach or to my data-driven approach, which I think adds opportunity, but also adds challenges. And I think this also probably clarifies. So I often talk about data-driven modeling and data-driven control, because this is what these type of techniques were originally called in the control systems community. But with the success of machine learning elsewhere, learning control has become more popular, but I kind of use those interchangeably. But obviously some parts of here, some of these optimizations are commonly done using machine learning as well, even going from data to a model, or going from data to a controller using reinforcement learning. And now if you add this image to the mix, I'm not the only one who realizes that there are challenges as well as opportunities. I think there was work out of Berkeley where they showed that, I mean, if your robot is trying to grab a block, but you have a slight offset depending on where that block is positioned, you're never going to grab it, which is why end-to-end learning is also come of interest in the field of machine learning. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunity here, particularly in terms of manufacturing. And that leads me to my current research interest, which is partly in theoretical controls and algorithm development on data-driven modeling and control for safety-critical applications. And then also some applied work, data-driven control for robotics and mechatronics, which goes to this high-precision side, and then automation and agriculture, which goes to this high uncertainty side. And yeah, as I mentioned, I think any automation in agriculture and also in further automation in mechatronics and new applications are going to be driven by vision and by machine learning. So again, I think that there are really interesting problems and really interesting opportunities. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Following, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Hey, Klaska. I have a pretty high level question, and it's more of an opinion that I'm asking for. Is you showed an interesting example of how I think it was the open loop response, you know, having quite a bit of variability between different people, but the closed loop response being more or less consistent in terms of performance. I'm just wondering, is that indicative of, you know, the idea that PID control loops are pretty much good enough for a lot of industrial applications? Is that the same phenomena that you're seeing there?
Well, that's a good question. For this application, I think yes. I think there are two different answers. So in this example, if you look at the time here, it's 150 seconds, right? And here we're controlling it. Yeah, with I don't know, what's the rise time is maybe 3 seconds, right? Because it has some overshoots, so 2 to 3 seconds. So it's a frequency. So these are linear systems, so it depends on the frequency. So you don't need to know if a system has an integrator. As long as your controller has an integrator, it'll get rid of that error. Does that mean you can get away with PID? That might not necessarily be the case. Like, it depends. It actually depends on how fast you want to control this. So here this works because my closed loop system is so much faster than the predominant uncertainty here. If I would want to control this system really, really slowly, I mean, that would be dumb. You'd probably just do a slow step, a slow reference instead. But if you want to decrease that closed loop bandwidth, you would run into trouble, and you would not be able to fix that with a PID either. That being said, in our work on control of anesthesia, there's a lot of debate and on what type of controller you should use. Should you use MPC? Should you use PID? And there was an article a lot of years ago that, I'm not sure if it was MPC, but something more complex outperformed PID, which is, I think, what got my supervisor in Vancouver really interested in this, because he didn't think that was the case. And so we actually ended up doing, in the last few years, some more fundamental comparisons. It's actually really difficult to compare different control methods, because the objective you're optimizing with your controller design step is usually not the same. So any comparison you make is generally unfair. So we compared PID with a EULA parametrization, optimizing the same objective function. And the conclusion is that if your uncertainty is high enough, PID is fine. Because what do those extra orders do? Well, they compensate for, especially for linear systems, they compensate for whatever's going on close around the bandwidth. But if that's so uncertain, there's nothing to win. So there's kind of two answers to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? One question from my side, possibly building on to the topic that Dean just introduced. I'm wondering on what value there currently is in these fields you're looking at in terms of integrating synthetic data sets, those generated from sources like finite element models, combined with techniques like transfer learning to boost the impacts of the real world data in improving or training these models, particularly related to the comment you just made about how in problems where uncertainty is so large, that there is this difference between a PID-based method and the method you're choosing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and a really interesting field of research going forward. It really depends on what you're trying to do with your model, ultimately, because that's where the uncertainty makes a difference. So I think that those kind of methods are going to be less and less general and more focused on specific objectives. And I think you can gain a lot by making the objective of the modeling and of whatever you do based on your model linked to the ultimate objective. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens there, but it really depends on the objective. So optimal path planning, safety, do you meet your safety guarantees? Especially, do you meet your safety guarantees is very, very different from feedback control. And that's one of the things we ran into here. I have really terrible low frequency gains. So I've got really terrible idea of what's going to happen in half an hour or in an hour from now. So if I put a safety system on top of that and I use a model like this, it's not going to work. So again, I think I'd like to see a split and a closer focus on the methodology with the objective that the methodology is used for. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I guess my interpretation of what you're saying is that given that it's so application specific, the use of such synthetic data sets depends on many things. Yeah, like the objective we're trying to achieve, how robust those models are, and that just changes from one field to the next.
Well, yeah, and what the impact of an error in that synthetic data set is on your ultimate outcome. And I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done to decrease that gap there.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, then I think we can wrap up today's session. However, I'll first pass over to Jolene, who will conduct the name draw. So for those who have attended today's session, we have a wheel of names. Jolene will be running to give out a prize.
Having issues with the camera.
Okay. So you should be able to share your screen, Jolene. I've just given you co-hosting privileges.
Is there an actual wheel, Bryn?
Yes.
A digital wheel. We don't have it
Okay.
printed out, just in the background, ready to go.
Okay.
So that would be more fun.
Sorry, Bryn, I'm having problems with my camera. Can you guys hear me?
I'm not able to hear you, Jolene. I can only hear you because you're in the same office as me, but
Yeah.
I'm not hearing you on this call.
Okay, so I'm having issues with my camera, but I have the wheel up, and if you'll entrust me, I'll give it a spin and I'll let you know the winner.
Okay, Jolene will put the recipient into the chat. She's having some technical difficulties on her side. So we'll just
So spinning.
drum roll.
The winner of a $25 gift certificate for Starbucks is Dean Rickards.
Dean, well done.
I'll be in touch.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, Jolene.
Fantastic. All right. Then with that, I think we can wrap up today. Thank you everyone for attending. Our next event is on November the 16th between 1 to 2 p.m. We will send out an invite for that. And we'll have 3 presenters in that session. Dr. Emily Cranston, Dr. Dean Richard here, and Dr. Mohammed Sheheta will be joining us. So we look forward to seeing you all there again on November the 16th. Thanks again and have a great rest of your afternoon. All right, bye.